The clatter of porcelain echoed like brittle bones snapping. A silver goblet tipped, spilling wine so dark it looked more like blood than Merlot. Guests laughed, oblivious while the candles guttered low, their flames shrinking as if afraid. From beneath the banquet table a girl's hand trembled. Slender, calloused, still red from the scalding pot she had carried only minutes before. She watched the nobles raise their cups, her own breath shallow, caught between terror and hunger. The roasted lamb's smell was thick, mingling with saffron and smoke, but beneath it was something else. Sharp, bitter, chemical. The kind of scent that lived only in places where things died slowly. No one noticed her eyes, wide as the shadows that stretched across the hall, as the first guest lifted the poisoned chalice to his lips. The wedding feast, the clinking of silver cutlery echoed like distant hammers on iron. The hall was alive with music, but beneath the violins there was a strange undertone, as if the strings themselves trembled with unease. Candlelight threw restless shadows across the carved beams overhead, and the scent of roasted lamb, spiced figs, and honeyed wine clung to the air so thickly it was almost suffocating. No one noticed the girl at first. She was too quiet, too small, her skin darkened by smoke and labor. Her eyes lowered whenever a guest's gaze strayed near her. She carried bowls steaming with saffron broth, trays heaped with glistening meats, her wrists thin as bone handles. They called her Leora, but only in passing, only when commands were barked. Otherwise she was invisible, like the ashes that clung to the edge of the hearth. The wedding was a spectacle meant to last generations. Lord Armand, the groom, son of a powerful family whose wealth came from vineyards and war. Lady Seraphine, the bride, pale and silent, her gown stitched with pearls, her face unreadable behind layers of silk and powdered blush. Their union was a consolidation of power more than of love. Everyone in the hall knew it, though no one dared speak it aloud. The guests, 99 of them, each more jeweled and perfumed than the last, filled the hall with laughter that rose too sharply, like glass threatening to shatter. They drank deeply, their goblets heavy, their lips red with wine. Beneath the laughter, however, was something else. The nervous stirring of 100 suspicions. Rivalries buried, debts unpaid, feuds merely paused for the sake of spectacle. And still, no one looked at the girl carrying the wine. Leora's hands trembled, though not from the weight of the goblets. Her fingers brushed the cold rims, her nails biting her palms as she steadied the tray. Every motion was deliberate, rehearsed, her breath shallow as though she was walking a rope stretched above a pit. She served the guests with lowered eyes, but inside her chest something snarled, something she had caged for too long. The hall was stifling, the air too thick with perfume and sweat. Each guest looked more grotesque by candlelight, their rings glinting like fangs, their painted faces cracking when they laughed too widely. They feasted, tearing lamb from bone with the same greed they had used to tear apart her world. She set another goblet down. The man did not thank her. None of them ever did. The music swelled. Toasts were made. Laughter rolled through the hall like thunder over storm fields, and in the corner, where the candles sputtered against the cold draft seeping through the stone walls, the shadows seemed to lean forward as if listening. The food smelled rich, overwhelming, yet under it, faint but unmistakable, was another scent. Bitter, metallic, a whisper of something that had no place in a kitchen. Leora felt it burn the back of her throat when she breathed too deeply. Her lips tightened. She moved faster, setting goblets into waiting hands, always unnoticed, always the servant. But inside her head, each thud of her heart counted upward like a clock ticking toward midnight. Lord Armand raised his chalice, his rings catching the firelight. He called for silence. To new beginnings, he declared, his voice booming across the hall. To peace, prosperity, and the union that will outlive us all. The guests roared their approval, voices colliding until they became something monstrous, a sound that filled the rafters and rattled the plates. The bride lifted her goblet as well, her hand shaking just slightly, though no one dared notice. The toast rose like a wave. 99 voices, one after another, echoing, chanting, drinking. The wine slid red down their throats. The music struck higher, sharper. The shadows leaned closer, and then a man's goblet slipped from his hand, the silver striking the table with a clang. His laughter curdled into a cough. His face, flushed with drink, twisted in confusion. He clutched his chest, his breath caught somewhere it should not be. The others laughed at first, thinking it drunken spectacle. They clapped, jeered, one even shouted for him to sit before he embarrassed himself. But his eyes told the truth. Wide, bloodshot, glassy with panic. His body jerked, spasmed once, twice, and then the laughter faltered. The hall fell silent. The first guest collapsed. The echo of his body hitting the stone floor reverberating through the wedding feast. Leora froze where she stood, tray still in her hands, her eyes locked on the fallen man. Her chest rose and fell, each breath a knife, and though no one yet saw her, though no one yet spoke her name, she knew in that instant the banquet had only just begun. Whispers of blame, the body on the floor was not moved. Not yet. He lay sprawled where he had fallen, goblet on its side, a dark red stain spreading like a wound across the linen tablecloth. Guests whispered in clusters, some too afraid to draw near, others staring openly as though proximity might grant them understanding. The music had stopped. The violinists stood frozen, bows trembling in their hands. Lord Armand barked for calm. His voice cracked through the silence like a whip, commanding order where none could be found. "It's nothing," he declared. "The man drank too much, that's all." But the words did not settle in the stomach the way wine did. They rolled instead into unease, heavy and sour. "Too much?" one guest muttered. "Too quickly, perhaps." "No," another whispered. "I saw his eyes. It wasn't drink. It was something else." The murmurs crawled across the hall, carried in low tones but sharp enough to cut. Servants kept their heads down, moving swiftly to clear spilled wine, to lay fresh plates as though habit could erase horror. Leora stood at the edge of the hall, tray clutched to her chest. She could feel the shift in the air, the way suspicion spread like frost across glass. It was invisible, but it changed everything it touched. The guests began their guessing. "It's the lamb," someone hissed. "No, the wine. The figs. They were brought from the east. Who knows what rot they carry?" One woman pressed a handkerchief to her lips as though to ward off infection. Another leaned close to her husband, eyes wide, whispering, "This is a curse. Someone has cursed the marriage." The word curse slipped easily into the hall, for curses explained what reason could not. And once spoken, it slithered through every ear, nesting in every thought. Lord Armand ordered the doors barred. No one was to leave until the matter was settled. The great iron bolts clanged shut, sealing them inside. The hall, once cavernous, suddenly seemed smaller. The air grew tighter, pressing in from the stone walls, suffocating with each anxious breath. The bride, Lady Seraphine, had not spoken a word. She sat pale and unmoving at the high table, her goblet untouched. Her gaze was fixed not on the body, not on her guests, but on the candles burning low, their wax running like pale tears down brass stems. And still, no one noticed the servant girl who watched everything. Leora's heart pounded. Her ears rang with the clamor of suspicion, each voice like a blade scraping too close to her skin. The tray in her hands felt suddenly heavy, her palms damp against the polished silver. She kept her head bowed, but inside her thoughts clawed wildly. They must not see me. Not yet. The steward was the first to act. A tall man with a furrowed brow and too much authority. He ordered the remaining wine collected. "It is the vintage," he insisted. The casks were not tested properly. Two servants rushed forward to gather goblets, but their hands shook so fiercely that one nearly dropped his. And then, another sound. A cough. A deep, rattling cough that silenced the hall. Every head turned. It came from a merchant seated near the center table, a man known for his loud opinions and louder purchases. His face was flushed, sweat dripping into his collar. He waved off the hands that tried to steady him, but the motion only worsened the tremors in his arms. His goblet toppled, rolling across the table, splashing remnants of red wine that glistened like blood in the candlelight. "No," he gasped. "No." The word cut short, strangled in his throat. His body jerked once, violently, and then again. He fell back, chair collapsing beneath him, limbs striking the floor with sickening finality. Screams erupted this time, not laughter, not whispers, but shrieks that clawed against the stone walls. The women pressed themselves against their husbands. The men shouted orders, accusations, prayers. Someone crossed himself. Another spat to ward off evil. The second body lay beside the first. The hall was no longer a place of celebration. It was a cage filled with terrified animals, and in the chaos suspicion sharpened. It was not the wine. The steward snarled, his certainty unraveling. The food, then. The lamb, the figs, no, look at them. This is no food sickness. This is murder. The word fell heavy, final. Murder. Leora's breath caught. The word rang in her ears not as accusation, but as acknowledgement, as though someone had finally spoken the truth aloud. Eyes turned to the cook, a sweating man who stammered denials, swearing on his knives and his mother's grave. Others pointed to the foreign spice merchant who had delivered the saffron and figs, his dark robe marking him as an easy scapegoat. Poison, one guest hissed. Yes, poison. Another agreed, eager for an explanation. The word spread, carried from lip to lip until it became fact. Poison. The hall quaked with it, fear swelling like a tide that threatened to drown all reason, and still. Leora stood silent, her head bowed, her tray clutched so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her secret lay invisible in plain sight, hidden behind lowered lashes and a servant's stillness. But in the corner of the hall, one man's gaze lingered too long. He was a scholar, a man with ink stains on his fingers and spectacles perched upon his nose. Unlike the others, he did not shout, did not accuse. He only watched, and he was watching her. The music did not return. The feast lay untouched. 2 bodies stained the stone floor, and 97 guests were left breathing. But each wondered for how long. Leora's heart pounded. Her chest tightened. For the first time she realized the scholar's eyes were not merely curious, they were suspicious. And in that moment, as the whispers grew louder, as fear fermented into rage, she knew her invisibility was ending. The girl in the shadows, the 2 bodies were left where they had fallen. No one dared touch them now. Their mouths hung open, their eyes glassy, fixed on something unseen in the rafters above. The candlelight painted their faces with a grotesque stillness, as if the feast had transformed into a gallery of the dead. The air was rancid with fear. It mixed with the sweet perfume of figs, the spice of saffron, and the metallic tang of spilled wine until the hall itself seemed to breathe with unease. No music played. The silence had weight, pressing against every throat. And then the whisper began. It moved from table to table, lips close to ears, fingers pointing when they thought no one noticed. Suspicion grew roots, tangled itself in rumor, and sprouted into something poisonous. The cook, one hissed. The merchant, another said. The bride, a third dared whisper, earning a slap of rebuke, but Leora felt it most keenly. Though her eyes were lowered, though her steps remained small and quiet, she could sense the shift in glances. The scholar's gaze had made the others restless. Servants, once ignored, were suddenly visible, their every movement scrutinized. The gift of invisibility was slipping from her shoulders, and she had nothing to cover herself with but silence. She carried an empty tray now, though her palms sweated as if it still bore weight. She moved toward the kitchen doors, seeking the dark safety of the hearth, but the murmurs followed like insects buzzing in her ears. Then, the scream. It tore through the hall, high-pitched, raw, pulling every eye toward the source. A young noblewoman clutched her goblet, staring into the red depths as though it contained the abyss itself. Her hand trembled, wine spilling onto her gown in rivulets that looked like slashes of blood. She pointed, her voice broken. It's not wine, it's blood. They've given us blood. Her goblet shattered as it hit the stones. The others gasped, craning their necks to see. The wine pooled on the floor, dark and glistening. To some it still looked like wine. To others, her words had poisoned perception itself. They swore they saw it too. Blood, thick and pulsing, soaking into the cracks. Panic spread like fire through dry grass. Witchcraft, someone spat. An omen, another muttered. The steward tried to restore order, but his voice was drowned out by hysteria. People shoved away their plates, overturned goblets, scraped chairs back as though distance could protect them from whatever curse had gripped the feast. And through it all, Leora stood perfectly still. She watched as their fear painted the world in colors only she had known, suspicion, dread, revulsion. For years she had lived invisible, treated as less than an animal, but now, every gaze trembled with the terror of death itself. She almost smiled. Almost. But then the scholar moved. He rose from his seat slowly, adjusting his spectacles with trembling fingers. His eyes swept the hall, calm in their calculation, and then rested on her. "You," he said softly. It was barely more than a word, but it cut through the noise. Heads turned, Leora's chest constricted. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a caged animal. The steward frowned. "A servant? What nonsense." "No," the scholar interrupted. His voice grew stronger, steadier. "She lingers where others scatter. She watches too closely. Look at her hands." Every gaze turned to her now. Her hands. Her trembling hands clutching the tray, the faint sheen of sweat on her palms, the tension in her shoulders. Leora lowered her eyes, but it was too late. The moment of invisibility was gone. "Show us the tray," someone demanded. "It's empty," she whispered, but her voice was too small, too cracked to sound convincing. The scholar took a step closer, then another, as if drawn by something only he could see. His eyes did not waver. Empty now, but what was on it before? The hall had become a noose. The walls pressed inward. The torches flickered as though struggling to breathe. Leora's throat was dry, her tongue heavy. She thought of running, but the doors were barred. She thought of speaking, but words might betray her more than silence, and then another sound. A wet choke. A chair scraping. Every head turned again, just long enough for her to breathe. This time it was an older man, his face turning purple, veins rising like cords beneath his skin. His goblet tumbled from his grasp. He clawed at his throat as though invisible hands were tightening around it. He fell hard beside the others. The third body, the hall erupted. Shouts, sobs, accusations. "It's the food." "No, the curse." "Search the servants." The steward seized two boys at random, dragging them forward as the guests screamed for answers. The cook shouted until he was hoarse. The spice merchant swore by his gods. The bride still sat silent, her face pale as marble, her hands folded in her lap as though she had been carved there. And in the chaos, Leora slipped backward into the shadows near the kitchen doors. Her breath was ragged, her pulse wild. For the first time, she wasn't certain if the faces she saw, the twisting mouths, the wide eyes, the trembling hands, were theirs or her own hallucinations. The shadows themselves seemed to whisper. The stone walls pulsed with a rhythm that matched her heart. The dead on the floor, did their eyes flicker? Did they watch her too? For a moment, she could not tell where reality ended and her own fevered mind began, but she knew one thing with certainty. They were beginning to see her, and once they truly saw her, there would be no turning back. The banquet becomes a tomb. The bolts on the great doors had been thrown shut hours ago, yet time no longer obeyed its own rules. It crawled inside the hall, thick and heavy, stretched thin between screams and silence. The feast had withered into something unrecognizable. The lamb lay untouched, its skin greased and cracking beneath the waxy light. Figs rotted in their bowls, flies gathering though no window had been opened. The saffron broth congealed to a cold golden sludge. And the wine. No one dared touch the wine now. Goblets sat abandoned, their rims dark, their liquid still as blood in a grave. 3 bodies lay stiff in the open, twisted where they had fallen, and no servant dared move them. The smell had begun to rise, faint but undeniable, a sweetness edged with decay. No one laughed anymore. The noble guests huddled in clusters, their finery wrinkled, their jewels dulled by sweat. Their whispers grew sharper, their hands restless on knife handles, on crucifixes, on one another's arms. The steward's voice had gone hoarse from shouting orders no one obeyed. The cook, red-faced and weeping, had been forced to kneel at the center of the hall while accusations flew at him like arrows. "You poisoned the broth." "No, the figs." "The figs were cursed." "You think me mad enough to poison the house of my own master?" The cook wailed, but his pleas only fed the frenzy. The foreign merchant had fared worse. His dark robe, his strange accent, everything about him marked him as guilty in eyes desperate for a scapegoat. Guests shoved him to the floor, their fingers clawing for his satchel of spices. He shouted in a language they did not understand, and their fear twisted it into confirmation of guilt. "An incantation," they cried. "He's cursing us even now." But the merchant's words were only prayers, and through the storm of fear and accusation, Leora moved like smoke. She no longer carried trays or pitchers. No one commanded her now. She slipped between shadows, eyes lowered but ears sharp, drinking in their terror. The guests barely noticed her. When they did, it was with the vague revulsion one might give to a stray dog skulking too close to the table. And yet, the scholar noticed, Always his eyes tracked her. He said nothing, but his silence carried more weight than their screams. Lady Seraphine had not spoken still. She sat at the high table, her gown a pale shroud against the dark wood. Her goblet sat before her, untouched, the gold rim catching each flicker of candlelight. Some said her silence was grief. Others whispered it was guilt. Still others wondered if she had already known this night would end in blood. The groom, Lord Armand, tried to command strength, but his voice betrayed him. He shouted for calm while his own hand trembled against his sword hilt. His eyes darted fever-bright, as though he searched the hall for an enemy he could strike down. The hall had become a cage. The walls pressed closer with each breath. The rafters seemed lower, the shadows longer. The windows stared inward like blind eyes. The air itself grew thick, heavy, charged with panic. And then another sound, a cough. A wheeze. Every head snapped toward it. The bride. Lady Seraphine's pale hand had lifted the goblet at last. Whether by choice or by some invisible compulsion, no one could tell. But the wine touched her lips and her throat worked once, twice, swallowing. Her eyes widened. Her hand trembled. The goblet tipped, spilling gold against white silk, red against pale skin. Her breath hitched. Her body spasmed, and the hall erupted into madness. "No!" Lord Armand bellowed, surging toward her, but she convulsed before he reached her. Her chair toppled backward, her limbs jerking, her pearls scattering across the stone like teeth. The bride of the night, the jewel of the union. The pale ghost at the center of the feast collapsed into the same silence as the others. The guests screamed, their panic tipping into full hysteria. Some pounded at the bolted doors, their fists bleeding against iron. Others tore at the windows, desperate for air that would not come. "It's the house," one woman shrieked. "The house is cursed." "No one leaves until the guilty is found," roared Lord Armand, his face purple with rage and grief. But reason had already fled. Knives were drawn, not against an enemy, but against one another. Old debts resurfaced, old betrayals named. One man accused his neighbor of plotting this to seize land. Another accused his cousin of hiring a witch. Swords clashed, rings clattered, blood splashed the stone. The feast had become a battlefield. And still Leora stood at the edge of the hall, watching. Her heart beat wildly, but her face was still. For the first time, they were not invisible to her. They were exposed, raw, ugly in their desperation. Their finery could not disguise them now. The scholar's gaze burned into her back. She did not need to turn to know he was watching. The bride lay dead. The groom howled. The guests tore each other apart. And the slave girl, silent and still, knew. The banquet had not yet reached its darkest hour, because 99 guests had not yet fallen, and she was not finished. The poison's truth. The hall was no longer a hall. It was a crypt dressed in velvet and candlelight. Bodies sprawled across the stones, their limbs twisted, their jewels glittering like offerings to some forgotten god. The smell of roast meat had soured. The air was heavy with wine, sweat, fear, and the first sour threads of decay. The once proud banquet table sagged under the weight of untouched food, plates smeared with grease and abandoned mid-meal. The survivors clung to corners, their eyes fever-bright, their voices cracked with exhaustion. Only half the guests remained standing, and of those, fewer still had the strength to shout. At the high table, Lord Armand sat slumped, his sword across his knees, his eyes fixed on the still form of his bride. His lips moved in soundless denial, whispering the same word over and over. Seraphine. No one dared disturb him. The steward, frantic and bloodied, tried to marshal order among the chaos, but his voice was shredded, his authority long dissolved. The cook wept openly. The merchant lay bound and gagged in the corner, his dark eyes burning with helpless fury. And through it all, Leora moved like a ghost. She had stopped pretending to serve. No trays, no goblets, no bowed head. She walked in plain sight now, and yet they still looked through her, their gazes sliding past as though she were smoke, all except the scholar. He followed her with his eyes as she slipped into the shadows near the kitchen door. He rose slowly, deliberately, his hand pressed to the edge of the table for balance. His face was pale, but his eyes were sharp. "You," he said again. This time the word did not vanish in the noise. This time it landed. Heads turned. Eyes followed. Leora froze. Her chest rose and fell. Shallow. Quick. The steward snarled, too eager to seize blame where he could. "The girl?" She's nothing. She's a servant. No. The scholar's voice cut like steel.
She is not nothing.
She is the only one who does not fear the wine. A murmur rippled through the survivors. The steward frowned, uncertain. She carries it, the scholar pressed. She pours it. She breathes it in. Yet she lives. Now they stared at her. Really stared. The gift of invisibility was gone. Leora lifted her chin just slightly. The flickering candles caught her eyes. Dark, unblinking, almost luminous in their stillness. For the first time she spoke. Her voice was soft, but it carried. Why should I fear it? The guests recoiled as though struck. Her words were not confession, not yet. But they carried a weight heavier than any denial. The steward's face twisted. What have you done? Leora's lips curved, the faintest shadow of a smile. Not joy, not cruelty, something colder. What has been done to me, she said, has only been returned. Her voice cracked the silence like thunder. For years she had been silent, voiceless, nameless. Now her words spilled into the hall like poison itself, slow and inevitable. They demanded answers. They shouted, cursed, begged, and Leora, she told them pieces, not the full truth. Not yet. She spoke of a village far to the east where the vineyards of Lord Armand's family had spread like a sickness, swallowing fields that had fed her kin for generations. She spoke of soldiers who came with fire and rope, who claimed land in the name of the noble house. She spoke of children taken as debt, of women made servants, of men buried in shallow graves. She did not name herself victim. She named herself witness. And now, she said, her voice steady, I am witness still. Her words silenced them. Even the steward faltered, his fury smothered beneath the weight of her calm. The scholar leaned forward, his eyes burning. The poison, where did it come from? Leora tilted her head. The candles threw her shadow long across the stones. From years of silence, she murmured. From the hands that beat and the mouth that commanded. From hunger sharpened into bone. From the soil you salted with greed. It came from all of you. The guests shifted uneasily, their faces pale. But then, her gaze flicked toward the high table. Toward the last untouched chalice. It glowed faintly in the candlelight. The gold rim casting shadows that seemed deeper than they should be. One chalice, still full, one chalice waiting. She stepped toward it, her feet soundless on the stones. Every eye followed her. Lord Armand stirred at last, his hand tightening on his sword. His grief-swollen face twisted into rage. You dare, he began, but the scholar interrupted, his voice shaking. No, let her speak. Let her show us. Leora stopped before the chalice. Her hand hovered above it, slender, steady now. She looked not at the wine, but at their faces, pale, sweating, trembling. You want truth? She whispered. Here it is. Her fingers brushed the rim. The hall seemed to shudder, the flames guttering as though the very air recoiled. Her secret was no longer hidden. The poison was not just in the goblets. It was in her. And the last chalice was hers to decide. The final twist, the last chalice gleamed in the half-light as though the candles bent their flames toward it. Its golden rim shimmered with a halo of menace, its crimson depths deeper than any wine had right to be. Every breath in the hall seemed to gather around it. Leora's hand hovered just above, her fingers trembling with a steadiness that was not quite human. She had spoken and they had heard. She had been seen, and she had not turned away. The silence that followed her words was thicker than all the screams that had come before. Lord Armand rose, his sword drawn, grief carving deep lines into his face. His bride lay cold at his feet, her pearls scattered like the teeth of a broken jaw. His voice shook with fury. You think yourself a prophet? A judge? You are nothing. A slave, a rat in the walls of my house. This is my hall. And you— The scholar's voice cut across him, hoarse but certain. This is no longer your hall. Don't you feel it? And indeed, they all did. The hall was changing. The air, once suffocating with heat and smoke, had turned cold, heavy, metallic. The shadows, once confined to the edges of the feast, now stretched across the walls like black veins. The bodies on the floor, 3, then 6, then 9, shifted in the corner of the eye as though breath had returned to lungs that should have been still. Someone whimpered. Someone else whispered a prayer, but the words faltered, forgotten mid-breath. The scholar's eyes locked on Leora. The poison, it wasn't only yours, was it? And at last she smiled, not cruel, not triumphant, but knowing. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried through the stone like thunder through a mountain. It was never just mine. The guests staggered, pressing back from the table as though distance could save them. Lord Armand gripped his sword tighter, but his hand shook slick with sweat. "What are you?" he spat. Leora lowered her eyes, almost demure. Her fingers brushed the chalice rim. "What you made," she said. "What you forgot. What you left to rot beneath your vineyards and your gold." The wine shivered. Tiny ripples spread across its surface, though no hand disturbed it. The bodies on the floor groaned. Not breath, not speech. Something heavier, deeper, a sound that should not have existed in a human throat. The corpses shifted, their limbs twitching, their eyes flickering open like shutters against the dark. Screams tore through the hall as the dead rose, not alive, not dead, but something in between. Their mouths moved soundlessly, their jaws hanging open, but their eyes fixed on the living, accusing, endless. 99 guests. 99 souls. The poison was not a toxin of herbs or metals. It was something older, a binding, a curse pulled from the marrow of the earth, distilled into a wine that carried not death but permanence. Lord Armand swung his sword, striking at the nearest corpse. The blade met flesh, but the body did not fall. It stared, unblinking, its mouth stretching open in a silent howl. The guests scattered, stumbling over tables, shoving against the bolted doors that no longer looked like wood and iron, but something grown from shadow itself. The hall was closing in, its walls pulsing as though the stone itself had veins, and in the center stood Leora, untouched. The scholar fell to his knees, eyes wide, tears cutting through the dirt on his cheeks. "You didn't just poison them. You bound them." Leora turned her gaze to him. "Not just them." The scholar's face went pale. The realization spread like fire. The survivors, few left now, looked at their hands, their lips, their breath, as though expecting to see the stain of it upon themselves. And slowly, horribly, they did. Their veins darkened, their lips cracked, their breaths came shallow. The poison was not something they had drunk in the wine. It was already in them. It had been waiting. It had lived in the soil they had stolen, in the water they had tainted, in the bloodlines they had crushed beneath their boots. Leora had not created it. She had only poured it. Lord Armand stumbled toward her, sword still in hand. His voice was ragged, breaking into a sob. You'll damn yourself too." Leora finally lifted the chalice. "I was damned long before this night." And she drank. The hall erupted. The dead surged, the walls cracked, the candles burst into black flame. The music returned, but not the violins. It was a sound like strings snapping, like voices wailing through stone. The survivors screamed, their throats torn raw, but their screams never ended. They became part of the sound, threads woven into the eternal music of the hall. Leora dropped the empty chalice. It rang once, sharp as a bell, and then silence fell. Not silence. Something worse. A stillness so complete it pressed against the skull, filled the lungs, seeped into the bones. The feast was frozen. Goblets raised, mouths open, eyes wide. 99 guests caught forever in the moment of their horror. And in the center, Leora stood motionless, her eyes reflecting the faint glimmer of candlelight. She was no longer slave, no longer servant, no longer invisible. She was the keeper of the hall. The curse had sealed itself. They would feast here forever, not eating, not drinking. Just endless, a banquet of silence and shadow. A wedding that never ended. And if you pressed your ear against the stone walls of that ruined estate, even now you could still hear it. The faint clinking of goblets. The low hum of voices trapped between breath and death, and a girl's whisper, soft and steady. "Drink. You must drink."